Hi, everyone. I am Jade. Thank you so much for having me. I am several hours away from Toronto now. So I'm grateful to be beamed in by Brockton for this little talk on book blurbs. I do have a slideshow of sorts. So I'm going to share my screen. I- I'm hoping you can all see the slideshow. Someone please let me know if not. So this talk is on the good and bad of book blurbs. And just a little advance apology to any graphic designers attending. I know there is at least one, my partner, so sorry to him and sorry to any others. I am not a graphic designer, as you will tell from the slideshow. So, what authority do I bring to this topic of book blurbs? Very honestly, not a lot. I am not a blurb expert. I don't think really any kind of expert in particular. Um, But I think authority is a little bit overrated, and I'm going to present some ideas to you, and I think you can judge for yourself whether they are good and helpful ideas. Having said that, I do have a little bit of experience in this field. Brockton did not choose completely unwisely in bringing me here to talk about book blurbs. So for 3 years, I was the first and only editor of the review section of a magazine called Carousel, which was a hybrid literary arts magazine that ran somewhat off and on, but for about 40 years altogether, before they finally ceased in 2023. During the time I was reviews editor, we actually published 146 traditional experimental reviews, which is quite a caseload for us, I guess, in that time. The photos here are just some covers of Carousel, like some of the last issues. And then also there's a couple, we used to do little graphics for our reviews as well. I've also written book reviews and literary criticism for a number of venues like Malhat Review, Hamilton Review of Books, the League of Canadian Poets, Ampersand Review, other places. Why am I mentioning all this about book reviews? Mainly because it really does inform my approach to book blurbs, which is partly a disclaimer. That is my bias. I am coming at book blurbs as a book reviewer primarily. But I also do have some specific book blurb experience. So I have written 4 book blurbs today, with one pending shortly. I've received about 8 blurbs in total for my 3 books, my poetry collection, my novel, and then my collaborative book, ZZOO as Made. I've also notably recently written an article on book blurbs for Writer's Digest called How to Love a Book Blurb. That one was a little bit more just geared towards all the ways that book blurbs can be great. This presentation will be a little bit more of maybe a balanced perspective of the pros and cons of book blurbs and how to navigate between those things. So I will tell you up front, I can't actually tell you what is good or bad about book blurbs because honestly, I don't think there is anything objectively good or bad. Different people probably value different things in their blurbs, whether they are writers or readers or publishers. So you're going to have to ultimately decide for yourself how you want to approach book blurbs, whether you're coming at them as a reader, writer, or publisher. But having said all that, with these many caveats, I do believe it's really helpful to see how other people think about problems or issues so that that can inform how you also think your way through a problem or issue. So even though I'm not a book blurb expert, I have actually done a disproportionate amount of thinking about the issue of book blurbs. And so what I'm going to try to do here is like lead you along the path of my thinking about them and my orientation towards them. And maybe for some of you, you'll just agree with what I'm saying and you'll be like, that's it. That's now my opinion on book blurbs. But more likely than not, you're kind of probably going to build on some of these ideas or think about them later, have your own ideas, disagree with me, whatever. Whatever your response is, I think that's great. I think the important thing tonight here is that we're talking about the issue of book blurbs and we're like working through some of the problems together. So for me, when I'm thinking about book blurbs, as I said, I've done a lot, particularly this year for a number of reasons. I like to start by thinking about or reminding myself what it is that I really value about book blurbs. So for me, there are 3 sort of big ones. So I like contributing to conversations about literature. I like selecting and arranging beautiful words, and I like the idea of building a literary ecosystem. And what do I mean by that? Let's unpack that for a second. So, contributing to conversations about literature. So, this is where you see kind of my background in book reviewing come in. I do believe that like books are not just these objects kind of isolated from the world around them. They are very much part of discourse and part of our ideas that are floating around in society. And I think having explicit conversations about books is important. And, maybe not all book blurbs fulfill this function, but I actually think book blurbs do have the capacity to contribute to these conversations about literature. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. Selecting and arranging beautiful words. Before I was ever doing book blurbs, I was writing and reading, and I love the process and the craft of writing. And that is one of the things that also informs my approach to book blurbs, as we'll go into further again in a minute. Building a literary ecosystem. I like the word ecosystem because I think community is a very good word and it describes a lot of things aptly. It's not always my favorite word because community often implies a sense of belonging and acceptance and all these kind of like positive connotations that, I think some of us can feel ambivalent about at times. I mean, there are lots of times when we maybe feel like we're not part of the community or not as much a part of various literary communities as we might want to be, but thinking of it more as like an ecosystem where in fact everything is interdependent and everything is really contributing to one another's existence, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad, but we're all surviving in this literary ecosystem. Sometimes I find it helpful to think about it that way so that it doesn't put like so much pressure on the term community. You of course may have a completely different view of that. That's cool. Anyways, these three things, as it turns out, are not just things I value in book blurbs, they're things I value about literature more generally, but today we're going to apply these values to book blurbs specifically. On the other hand, I also think it's really important to understand what you dislike and what maybe you even hate. And I think this helps us understand book blurbs, literature, all those kinds of things. I mean, culture is very bound up with taste and with priorities and values and norms and all these kinds of things. And so if we're going to look at what we value and like about book blurbs, I think it's also equally important to look at what drives us up a wall about them. And then that helps steer our conversations around them and helps steer us in terms of our own orientation towards this issue of book blurbing. So I actually think that by looking at what things we don't like about book blurbing, that will help guide us, ironically, towards a better relationship with book blurbs. So my own pet peeves about book blurbs. I do not like the ways they can sometimes reinforce literary hierarchies. I don't like disingenuousness and I don't like unoriginality. And like my values in the past slide, these pet peeves I have about book blurbs, I think are also equally applicable to the literary world more generally. But I want to unpack for a second what I mean by these things in reference to book blurbs. So reinforcement of literary hierarchies. As I'm sure you may have noticed, the publishing world does still function on hierarchies in various ways. Whether it's nepotism or elitism or the kinds of ways that, like, what kind of school did you go to, and the kind of school you go to influences the kind of career you have, and the awards you win influences the career you have, and the people influences the career you have. And then there can be various tendencies to put writers on pedestals for winning awards or for selling a lot of books or for making a lot of money or whatever. All of those things I am not interested in. I mean, I'm interested in them. They're very interesting problems. But I try to stay away from them and minimize their impact on my work as much as possible because I don't find them particularly helpful to dwell on. I think inevitably we dwell on them because they affect us, but I still try to steer away from that and towards things I value more so. And so book blurbs, the way they're bound up in this, of course, is, I'm sure you've noticed if you look at like a book from a big 5 publisher, especially if they're a big name author, they have got a laundry list of all of the other famous authors with big 5 publishers, and they are all saying, oh, this work is wonderful, and they blurb each other and whatever. So we see how book blurbs can contribute to these hierarchies and sort of uphold them. Disingenuousness is probably an obvious one and is kind of related to this like what we were just talking about. Like disingenuousness to me is like people who either blurb books they don't really like, maybe at worst blurb books they haven't really read. It's hard to tell. I don't think we have great stats on how widespread that is as a phenomenon, but that does not mean that we as blurbers or whatever have to contribute to it. We can certainly steer ourselves in the opposite direction. And then the other thing that bugs me about book blurbs often is unoriginality. I'll give some examples of what I mean by that. But basically, yeah, I'm going to stop there for the moment. I'm sure you can guess what I mean. Let's go into the actual practical, concrete examples. So I've split this presentation up into the sort of different ways each of us can relate to a book blurb. If you are a writer, you've probably done all of these things. If you are more of a reader, you will have done some of these things. We're gonna look at like if I'm on the receiving end of a book blurb, like I've written a book, I need a blurb. We're gonna look at if I'm writing a book blurb for someone, and then we're gonna look at like also if I'm just a sort of slightly more passive recipient of the book blurb. I am like maybe considering buying a book, I'm reading the blurb, but so let's start with like, what do I do as a receiver of book blurbs to sort of make the experience more enjoyable, to push it towards things I value about blurbing and literature and push it away from the things I do not like? So the first thing I do is if I'm looking for people to blurb one of my books, I try to do a lot of research on my own. I certainly don't rely on my publisher who, may know many things about me and my book, but they certainly don't know everything. They don't like you are sort of the best authority on your own book in most cases. So I try to do a lot of research and generate a list of authors who I might think might be a good fit for giving me a blurb. And so I try to look at like writers who've influenced my book, like whether that's stylistically influenced or I read a bunch of their books as like research for content or whatever it was. I might look for writers who have just in general influenced me as a writer, and whose uh, you know, whatever it is, tools I might use in my own writing regularly. And then I also look to writers who are already familiar with my writing. So that could be like, people you've taken classes with, people you've done readings with, people whose books you've reviewed, whatever it is. Like if we've had some kind of engagement with one another, they're usually maybe a good place to start to think about as like someone who might write a blurb. Notably, like I generally on this list of people I think might be good blurbers, the focus is not on like who's the most well-known author I can possibly convince to blurb my book. It's more like who's a good fit for the book itself. And to me, this really works toward like undermining hierarchies, which I've already said I don't like. It works toward further like building connections in a literary ecosystem because you work with what like existing connections there are, whether those are like personal, professional connections or whether those are, just the other books that your book is in conversation with, like thinking about it as like like I said, like an ecosystem, like an environment you're in, and like where does my book fit? And so who are the people like closest to me in that ecosystem who might be good people to sort of comment on my book? Um, at that point, I might talk to the publisher. I mean, there's a number of ways that you relate to your blurbers. You might, if they're like someone you know closely, you might just reach out to them yourself. But if there's someone you don't know, sometimes it's easier or more appropriate for your publisher to reach out. Again, using like if we use this concept of like an ecosystem, it's sort of like figuring out how everybody relates to each other and where I fit in there and proceeding accordingly. A big thing, of course, is not taking rejections or silences or non-response from blurbers personally. There are a million reasons why people are busy or don't think they're a good fit, don't want to hurt your feelings, and it might have nothing to do with you or the quality of your book. And so in the interest of like sort of preserving relationships and thinking about writing and literature as like a reciprocal activity that we do with and for one another, um, you know, understanding that those relationships shouldn't be like one-to-one transactional. And so, you know, just accepting the blurbs you get and not worrying about the blurbs you don't get. As a writer of blurbs, I actually think for me this is the bigger part of the work. Um, and so there's going to be a few slides on this one. This one I have a lot of thoughts about. So there's a bunch of work I do before I even write the blurb. Obviously, in some kind of I, as we all know, life is not perfect. A more kind of practical approach to writing book blurbs, which is like when I think about writing the book blurb, basically like, is that as good a use of my time as it would be to work on my own writing or read a different book or edit a friend's poem or whatever other literary things I could be doing with my time? Does writing a book blurb feel equally meaningful? Does it feel like it's contributing to the kind of literary life I value having, all of that kind of thing? If yes, and if, just on a practical level, I have time to do it, then to me, that's a good reason to do a book blurb. On the other hand, if I am having this feeling, like, when you have like a household chore, like laundry or I don't know, raking leaves or whatever it is you do, and you're like, oh God, I got to do that later. If that's the feeling you're having when you're thinking about the prospect of writing a book blurb, I take that as a good sign not to do the book blurb. The unconscious mind tells us all kinds of things in sometimes very indirect ways. So if I've decided doing this book blurb is a good idea, what do I do? So obviously I read the book. I would never write a book blurb for a book I've not read completely in full. So that goes back to this idea of like valuing ingenuousness and sincerity when writing a blurb. And I really try to make note of like, as I'm reading, like what are things that are standing out to me as being special, important, unique, whatever. Like what is making me care about this book? Why do I think anyone else should care about this book? Is it something about the content? Is it something about the form in which it's written? Is it, a million things, of course. But I try to make some notes about like what makes this book stand out and what makes it really truly worth reading. And then if they're available, I'll also look at promotional materials for the book, not because I want to be constrained by them, but because I want to look and see, like, is there anything in the synopsis or in the other blurbs, again, if they're available already, that feels like missing? Like, is there something they haven't picked up on that's like really cool about this book that I can draw attention to because I noticed it and I think it's worth drawing attention to? And so I usually take that as sort of my starting point for writing a blurb. The other thing I do as I'm crafting the blurb is like I treat it like any other writing activity. Like if I were sitting down to write a poem, I would care very much about my craft and style and having like, a compelling voice and whatever it is you think is important in writing craft and style. For me, it's like I love, I call them $10 words. Like I love good vocabulary. I love a sense of rhythm in prose. I love, et cetera, et cetera. Whatever those things are that like you think makes writing good, like prose writing good, apply that to a book blurb. I mean, a book blurb should also be beautiful. Well, I say should for my value system. I don't want a blurb personally. I hate a blurb that just sounds like marketing copy. I realize it is marketing copy, but at the same time, it's like your blurb is talking about this book to people who are readers and people who are writers and people who love the written word. And so I think a blurb should reflect that beauty of literature within itself and within the way it's written. I said I don't like unoriginality, so like I have, to be honest, I didn't put all of them here, but I have a list of words I just absolutely hate to see in a book blurb. I completely made up this quote, a luminous debut from a writer to watch, but like how many book blurbs we have seen that are some variation of that or some variation of like a propulsive page turner or whatever. Like there are definitely catchphrases people love to use in book blurbs, and I'm not saying don't use them. I'm saying personally when I'm writing blurbs, I know I don't find that compelling, and so I try not to use them. I try to like find more original or more, at least more like personal to me and my writing style ways of talking about the book. Because like if someone is asking you to write the blurb, it's because they like you and your work and they respect your work or whatever it is. And so I want to bring myself to the writing of the blurb in a way that highlights the book and highlights its wonderful qualities, and also is written in a way that couldn't have just been said by literally anyone else. And then after writing the blurb, I think this is kind of an sometimes underappreciated part of the work. But I think it is actually good to like maybe connect with the writer in some way. Like if they're a friend or if they're at least someone I know as an acquaintance, like I will reach out to them. I'll maybe talk to them a little bit about their book. The reality is most of us writers receive relatively limited attention for our books. And writers love to talk about the work they've done. And it's a great way, if I've just read the book, it's a great way to, bond with other writers, talk to them about their book a bit, and also maybe tell other people about their book, whether that's like word of mouth or you post on social media or whatever it is you do. I think like as a blurber, in a way, you're kind of like a herald or an ambassador of the work. You don't have to do that. It's not a requirement, but if you've done all this work to read the book and write the blurb and you really actually do love the book as much as you say you do in the blurb, to me, that's just sort of like a natural outcome, is that I'll try to share that with others. Okay, as a reader of blurbs, this is one of the easier jobs, I think, is just, you're looking at books and sometimes you read the blurbs, or maybe you don't. I am a bit ambivalent about this. I go both ways. Blurbs are almost never the main reason why I pick up a book. I usually am looking at like the synopsis or what a reviewer has said about the book, or like something about the content of the book that really compels me. And I would never not pick up a book because there aren't any great blurbs on it. That's just completely counterintuitive to me. I suspect many readers feel the same way, but again, I don't know that we actually have a lot of great stats on the sort of marketing effectiveness of book blurbs. And so, like, when I do pay attention to blurbs, it's usually because they have something in the description, like as if I was reading the synopsis of the book. They have something that really like stands out to me. It's like, oh, that's a particular quality in this book that sounds really intriguing to me. There's something unusual. Like I know as a reader, I'm never impressed again by, as I just said, like things like, oh, this is a writer to watch or whatever. Okay, like that's great. There's a million writers. You can watch any writer. What I look for is like clues in the blurbs, clues as to like what the book is going to be like. Is it the kind of book that I normally would want to read, or is it there's something strange or surprising about the blurb that really draws me to that book? I'm usually not really interested in like who has written the blurb, because again, literary hierarchies, not super interested in those. But if there's like an author whose like work I personally absolutely love and they've said something that kind of intrigues me about the book, like that might help sell me on it, only in the sense that I'm like, well, if that writer is working in a sphere I'm interested in and they're very interested in this other book, maybe they're all inhabiting the same part of the literary ecosystem, and maybe that's a place I kind of want to wander around for a bit. And that's about the end of the presentation. That is what I do in my various relationships with book blurbs. But the question to you now, what will you do?
Questions. Not questions. Get on the train, Jade. Hey. He's got questions about book blurbs. No? Oh, you had a thing. You've got a question? Or no? Okay. I mean, I will ask questions if nobody else will ask questions. Hi, Jade. So, how do you ask somebody to blurb your book? Because that seems like really vulnerable and scary. And like, what would be the best way to present it? Like, I feel like I'd be like, hi, like, no pressure. You don't have to. I really like you. Please, it's okay to say no, but would
Yeah.
you? And like, there's probably a better way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does depend hugely on whether you know the person, how you know the person, et cetera, what your whole past relationship is. Um, I would say I guess I'll talk about the most common scenario, which is maybe you know them a little bit, like you might have met at some point, or at the very least, you're very familiar with their work, like you have some kind of connection. So I always start by being like, hi, I'm reaching out to you about possibly burbing my book. This is how we know each other. Like, unless we're like best friends and they know me intimately well. I might be like if it was like, oh, I read with you 5 years ago to reading kind of thing. I might mention that just to be like, and then I briefly mentioned like why I thought of them, like why am I even reaching out to them? So, this might be like you wrote book, whatever, which, my book has a lot of things in common with that book. And that's why I'm contacting you specifically, just to give them a sense that I'm not like randomly blanketing out emails to every writer I know asking for a blurb, which is not a practice I recommend. I do recommend it being very like specific and targeted in who you're reaching out to. So give them like a little bit of context for why I'm reaching out and if we know each other, how we know each other. Um, include like optional things for them to review, like, attached is a PDF of the book, or attached is an excerpt, or whatever you and your publisher have decided is appropriate to send out. Usually, like if it's someone who doesn't know me well, I might give like a short bio, maybe even as an attachment that they can read if they're interested. Um, Short, like very short thing about the book that I think might draw them in, or like, you know, uh, help them get a sense of what I'm asking. Like, this is a 300-page novel, which is very different than being like, this is a 20-page chapbook. Like, give them a sense of what they're getting into. And then, exactly as you said, basically being like, no worries if not, kind of thing. Basically, I really appreciate you taking the time to consider this request. Absolutely understand if this doesn't feel like a good fit, but I just wanted to reach out. Like, something just very kind of gentle and um, chill, as chill as possible while still, being polite and professional and all of that. Um, I don't think there's like a magic formula as far as I can tell. It's a little bit like when you do a submission to a literary magazine, right? It's like there's the basics, like give them the information they need, be polite, try not to be too long-winded, but give them a little bit to work with. And yeah, I don't think you need to reinvent the wheel on requesting book blurbs. And when all else fails, ask, a writer friend or your publisher, whoever, like, do you have a template for sending out book blurb requests, and work from there. That always works too.
What happens when you when you do a blurb and then you end up hating it or you're offended by the word?
I heard part of that question. I heard something about what happens if you hate.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear it?
Yep.
Hear it? Yes.
Speak louder.
What's that?
Speak louder.
Speak louder. Okay. What happens when when you end up like you're asked to do a blurb and you hate it or you're completely offended by the word?
Oh, like if you're asked to do a blurb, oh, don't do the blurb. Like, please, for the love of God, don't do the blurb. Yeah, I mean, like people say no to book blurb requests constantly. A polite no, or even, and you don't have to say why. You can just be like, this is not a great time for me. Wish you out with your book or whatever. I've had some bizarre interactions with people around book blurbs, and like, I will not even say they're bad in the end. There was a very memorable instance where someone was like, okay, you've requested I blurb your book. I've read your book. I have 2 pages of thoughts on your book, but I'm not sure I really liked it. And they're like, but if you want to use something from the many pages of thoughts I have, you're welcome. And I was like, this is a very awkward interaction for both of us. It worked out well. We're actually like friends now, but I think probably in that instance, I don't have time right now would have been fine. I've also alternatively gotten, I am requesting a book blurb, and they were like, here's why I have a moral opposition to book blurbs. And we had a good chat about it. And again, that was also like totally fine in the end. We're on good terms and all. But I was like, man, like in the moment when I was just feeling sensitive about, my fledgling book, I was like, I think I would have just preferred a gentle, I can't right now. So that is my advice. If you don't like the book, definitely say no. If you're on the fence about the book, probably say no. If you feel anything less than like stoked to read the book and talk about it, probably just say no as gently and evasively as you can. Would be my suggestion.
Okay, I need a quick question, just I guess kind of about blurbs in general.
Mm.
Is there a world where maybe you are asking someone to do a blurb for your book and people expect like a payment? Is this something like artists just do like
Oh,
in goodwill, good faith, or is there a world
yeah.
where people are paying for these sorts of things?
I mean, I'm sure there is a world where you can pay for blurbs, but not one I would personally recommend entering. Which, there's, since I just mentioned this long moral opposition conversation I had about book blurbs, one of the sort of objections the person had to book blurbs was like, well, it's all this free unpaid labor from writers, and I completely respect that. I mean, it is. I think that is why we have to be very gentle in our requests and understanding when people reject our requests, because it is should be done for free. It's supposed to be just a completely good faith like endorsement of your book, not a paid service, and it is a lot of unpaid labor, which I mean, I'm sure we all have lots of thoughts about the place of unpaid labor in literature and the complications around that. Um, but yeah, book blurbs generally are done for free. I think that is probably for the best. Otherwise, just pay like a marketing exec to do your work. um, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think to me, having book blurbs be free is really sort of crucial to like the preserving some vestige of the like ingenuousness and sincerity and all of that. Um, I mean, like, yes, some people do book blurbs as favors to other writers or favors to a publisher or whatever. And, maybe it's not 100% sincere, but I think the fact that they're free at least minimizes that phenomenon a little bit.
Questions? Okay, thank you very much for being here with us today. Sorry.
Thank you
Thank
so much for
you,
having me.
Jade. We'll all blurb all of your books for free, all of us. I'm committing on behalf of all of us to blurb your books for free.